Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started, just to be conscious of everyone's time today. But I'm Corey. I'll be the moderator for this session on Beyond Drive Wheel Position, Key Considerations for Power Wheelchair Base Selection. It'll be presented by Angie Kiger, who will be joining us in just a moment. But I do want to remind you all that Angie's email address will be provided at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions specifically for her, that will be available at the very end in our last slide. And also, if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop all your questions down in the chat box and I will be responding in there. And we'll also save any questions that you have for Angie until the very end when she gets done with her presentation. So I'll be asking those for her and they are completely anonymous. So nobody else will see your questions, so don't feel embarrassed at all. I promise I am the only person that will see your questions. So feel free to ask. And otherwise, I'll toss it over to Angie, who will be going over all the CEU logistics.
Absolutely. So hopefully you guys can hear me and see the screen appropriately. If not, be sure to let us know. Let us know in the chat box, though, because my phone's actually turned over. Sometimes my coworkers will give me heads up during these, and I turn my phone over, so I'm fully attentive on you guys as we do this webinar. And I will be turning on my camera. I want us to go over logistics first, and then I'll turn the camera on. Corey and I were going back and forth on whether or not I should have it on today, but he says I should, so I will turn it on for y'all. So post-webinar follow-up, we've got handouts. We have mentioned that, and also certificates of participation. Those will go out. This has been certified for continuing education units. We partner with VGM Education, and it has been credentialed through ISET, the International Association for Continuing Education and Training. It's a bit of a mouthful. Make sure that if you're looking for state level, state licensure and all that good stuff, just a gentle reminder, always be sure to go in and check with your state licensure boards for information on what exactly is needed. And if you decide to earn the continuing education credits, what will happen is for my live attendees, you guys will receive an email within 48 hours after the webinar. And what that will look like is it will include an email with instructions and then 2 attachments to it on what you need to do to follow directions for getting the CEUs. CEUs are considered to have value when it comes to, because you need them for your licensure and for additional certifications. So what does that mean by telling you it has value? I want to make sure you guys are aware that we have done our due diligence to research this for the coverage of you guys and for us. And it is considered, if something has value, we cannot give that away to folks who recommend our products. So bear in mind there is a very small fee if you decide to apply or take the test, I should say, for your continuing education units. It's $15. But regardless, all attendees will get a certificate of attendance. So some states that is perfect. That's good enough for your state level CEUs. We are able to provide that with you also. That's a lot to comprehend. I understand. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email us. Happy to answer. I assure you that keeping on track of this good stuff is something that that's hard if you aren't used to it. So I'm cutting on my camera now. Hopefully you guys can see me. I'm gonna minimize it and get it out of the way so I don't have to look at the screen and look at myself the whole time. But there should be a gray bar on your screen to make me bigger or smaller. I'd vote for smaller. Put me at the top, put me on the side, however you would like. So content disclosure, yes, as Corey and I go through this, just so you guys both know that we both do work for Sunrise Medical. I am the author of the presentation, and I do work full-time for Sunrise Medical. During this webinar, because it is for CEUs, and I have to give you this content disclosure, make sure you guys are aware that we are not endorsing any specific brand, model of product, or manufacturer as a part of this educational session. You will see images of our products. If you have product-specific stuff, we absolutely welcome those questions. Please note we will need to get back with you on at a different timeline for that. But if you have like really cool product questions that you're dying to ask, say a product manager or whatnot, or reach out to your local representative. Next month, we'll sneak peek. Our next webinar is actually going to be with one of our product managers. So very exciting. You'll be seeing information come out about that. So let's get cracking and talk about our objectives. So At the conclusion, basically, you guys are going to be able to talk about 3 critical questions to include within the interview process for your hands-on portion and interview process of your wheelchair and seating mobility evaluation for a power wheelchair. The title of this webinar is Beyond Drive Wheel. And the reason why I did that is because a lot of times when we talk about comparing wheelchair bases, the first line that all of our brains often will go to is mid-rear or front. Which one do you want? Which configuration do you want? But there's a lot more that actually goes into that process. So we're going to talk a teensy bit about drive wheel, but then we're also going to talk about other things related to the base. So you're going to be able to know what questions to ask during interviews in your evaluation. You're also going to be able to talk about different components of a wheelchair base that may impact the client's overall success. Everything from motors to the ability to transport the chair goes into the whole package because we're looking at the person's entire lifestyle, right? Like we're not just thinking about inside the home, outside the home, at school, at work, wherever. We're looking at the person's entire lifestyle. So we're going to talk about different components related to wheelchair base. And at the conclusion of this webinar, you're also going to be able to talk about 3 considerations to review specifically related to transporting that power wheelchair. It's a big question that we get a lot of times, whether it is someone who is a parent of a child that has a disability that they're considering exploring power mobility for, or it's someone who is newly injured and they're getting a power wheelchair, or maybe someone's going for their 2nd or 3rd power wheelchair and they've already got a setup perfectly set up in their car, in their vehicle, and they need to think about what considerations that would look like for them to be able to use their current vehicle. Talk about all of it. That's right, within an hour. So we probably should get cracking, right? I'm jumping the content. So what do we know about power wheelchairs? Real quick, just touch on this. We know they're there to provide mobility and function. Power wheelchairs, their primary components, when we think about a power wheelchair, we think about the base, we think about seating. My clinicians that are on here are going to say seating absolutely is the first thing we think about because if they're not positioned properly, how are they going to be able to drive a chair? Among other things related to seating. Of course, drive controls, motors, batteries, additional components, positioning equipment, and electronic accessories. So today during this webinar, what I have circled there, that's really what we're going to be focused on for discussing our power wheelchairs. When I look at this area, we're talking about specifically the base. Now, please know there are some electronics that go off of the base, they go up a little bit higher, but we will be talking just a tiny bit about electronics too, but really and truly kind of the brains of the chair, and then also talking about everything else related to the base of that chair. What goes into the decision-making process of a power wheelchair? Don't need to camp out too long on evaluations. Could do whole other webinars on that, but I think we need to always direct ourselves back, right, to what's most important when we're talking about the decision-making process. There are a number of players that go into this process also, whether you identify as being the lead clinician on this and you're the evaluating clinician, or you're a supporting clinician where, say, you don't work in an inpatient or outpatient facility, but you work in a school system and your client or your student is headed for an evaluation, or if you're the complex rehab technology provider, or also the service technician or the physician. All of those guys, y'all all can relate or somewhere fit in to choosing the best chair for that person. But at the end of the day, the specific choice is really going to be up to that client. But we want to look at 3 big areas, right? Medical needs, funding, and functional desires. Now, each of the team members, wherever you fit into whatever category of that, each of those team members are probably thinking, I lean more one direction, right? So we'll talk about what that looks like as we go on. Look right there in the middle. You just saw a nice little tiny little power wheelchair came right into that middle. Why? Because we have to find that sweet spot, and that's why it's super important that we really look at all these different areas. Don't worry, don't freak out. That is a CRT evaluation roadmap that I show in a lot of different presentations. It is a gentle reminder that these are 16 easy steps to getting a new wheelchair for your client. I gotta say that tongue in cheek because there could be more, there could be less steps that are needed. But this was something that a dear colleague of mine down in Dallas, Texas, and I put together a few years ago for another presentation we were doing. And I think it's just an interesting one to bear in mind. But the one I talked about specifically during the objectives, and I was thinking about this presentation, was really, let's focus on that client interview. And please note that even though it is It is the spring here. It's the end of April. We're recording this. That means my allergies have kicked in, so you're definitely going to be seeing me sipping on water because I will get very dry when it comes to allergy season. So excuse me for that. All right, let's look at the unconventional questions that may be specifically related to choosing that power wheelchair base. Before I get too deep into these, well, I realize that I already brought one bullet up there. I was a little trigger happy on the clicking, but quick reminders, right? Any interview process that you're doing with the client for the evaluation, do your best to make it a one-on-one discussion. I know some folks really thrive on and need the question and answers and need those visual triggers to say, okay, I mean, 1, 2, 3 kind of really check boxes, if you will. Those are very important, and I get that. But I encourage you to consider expanding your style. And what I mean by that is it is all sorts of facts that are out there, research is out there on white coat syndrome. And if someone thinks they're coming in for a test, we automatically want to prepare for the test, right? Most humans are overachievers by nature, right? So, it's pass or fail, right? I got to make sure I answer the on my game, if you will. But really and truly, what we're looking for is something that is more of a conversation. And actually, my sister-in-law, who is a physician, is the one. Tammy has been practicing internal medicine for 2022, so 22 years since she graduated from medical school. And talking with her, one of the things that she talks about is that if a patient comes in and doesn't really tell her the full story, she can't prescribe or really know what's going on. So we want to create that comfortable atmosphere. Same thing happens with us for wheelchairs, right? So some of the unconventional questions that you may want to add to your repertoire of questions is, talk to me about your house. How long have you lived there? What is this going to do? So example for me is I'm going to give is, let's say, let's talk about the house that I grew up in. So if I was, asking my parents that they've since moved, but we'll use that as an example. How long have you lived here? Well, Jim and Sandy would say, we built this house in 1969. Well, instantly, I'm going to really start to sit there and think of, okay, I wonder what kind of modifications that they've made, ADA and universal access and regulations like that regarding building really weren't there. So what is that going to paint the picture of for knowing exactly spaces and whatnot? Another thing to think about here is how long this person lived there. They may tell you if they own, if they rent. Just a nice little conversation to have to know if modifications can be made. This is a fun one. If you're looking to really engage and bond with those folks, is if you could have those brothers from HGTV come into your home or in your house to change one or two things, what would it be? Odds are people are going to mention things and that I have found specifically related to areas that are accessibility issues. We know universal design exists. We know that it exists in building. There's some great folks that are out there doing some great stuff with home modifications, but the reality is universal design is a newer concept when it comes to home builds. And so we may be able to identify specific areas that, hey, that individual or their families have an issue with. And can a power wheelchair and the size of that base and the turning radius, can that be impacted there? What's your favorite thing to do with your family? Can you describe your ideal weekend? These are two kind of put together here. And the reason why I say these guys is because you want to know what happens with the person's life, not just at home. For my folks that are utilizing Medicare for a primary funding source for this, we know Medicare is truly worried about what happens in the home, but we also know the reality and the functional, don't forget functional desires was one of those 3 bubbles that I had on there, those 3 circles. Your functional desires of your clients, they want to be able to go out and about and do things. So if you get an idea of can you describe your ideal weekend? Well, if I look at someone, and right now my parents don't have any mobility needs, but I think about their age group, right? And I look at Jim and Sandy and what are they out and about doing? They don't get out as much as I would wish they would, but typically what they do is they go to church. They'll go shopping, they'll go to Walmart. Flip side of that, if you've got maybe a younger user who is a parent, they might say, hey, I've got to take my kiddos to school. I've got to be able to then head off to the office. And then on the weekends, my kids play travel soccer. So I need a wheelchair that's going to be able to get me across the soccer field so I can go watch my child play. So learning all these sort of things are going to help you also, not just for drive wheel discussion. Remember, we're going beyond drive wheel. We could think about everything from how long the battery life needs to be and suspension. We'll learn more about that. When you travel, are you more of a road trip person or do you like to fly? when we talk about batteries, that's going to come up and be key. Actually, my moderator on here, one day I have to do a webinar with him specifically related to travel, because he can tell you a whole different things to think about if you're going to be traveling in your power wheelchair, because Corey uses a power wheelchair when he travels. But that's a key one when he's talking about getting a new chair that I'm sure he goes over, is wanting to discuss what he does in his personal life, but then also, what do we need for battery life? Can the batteries fly? What type of batteries can fly? All that kind of good stuff. Do you consider yourself a more mountain person or a beach person? No, this isn't a first date that you're going on with your clients, but this will also help you understand what happens related to tires, tire sizes, types, suspension. Once again, where's that person going to want to go and get into? Have you ever tried an Alexa type system? It says Alex on here. I've tried that numerous times. So I apologize for not getting it. For some reason, the daggone autocorrect always corrects it back to Alex. So what I mean by that is Alexa or Siri system. And I'll ask users that because some folks already have their home set up in a smart home format, and they may be using an app, say like a smart home app through their phone. I've actually got one on my phone that I've worked with power wheelchairs with. And I know my colleague, who's our director of technical education, has done a lot with this. He's listening in on this webinar today too. But talking about syncing up your phones, that can actually determine what sort of power wheelchair options, that goes on with the electronics of the brain of that chair. So maybe that person wants to be able to, it is life or death that they are able to connect into that system to be able to call for help. That could be something that we need to make sure that that chair has the ability to do that. Who do you most visit and where does that person live? Once again, we're looking at outdoor areas, looking at areas where, what does that transportation look like? When you say what kind of vehicle do you plan on using? So basically, these are just some unconventional questions. So really, like I said, try your best to understand and get to know that person's life. This is not, I get it for you guys that are like, whoa, Angie, you were asking us to have a whole first date with these people? Get a little personal. You'll be able to gauge your audience. You'll be able to understand what is going on, and they'll really and truly understand too if you explain it to them. Transparency and honesty, guys, not only works out for relationships in and outside of work, but also with your clients too. So with that said, all you need to do is real simple, right? So 1 + 1 equals the answer, right? So make sure you understand what's going on with the medical needs, their funding and functional desires. Oh, but wait. You've also got to look at a little word map or word art, if you will, that actually created, because I'd say probably right when the pandemic started, early 2000, I was working on a presentation. I went ahead and I sent out an email to a bunch of my friends that utilize wheelchair and seating, not their therapist, but actual end users, and was like, talk to me about what's most important to you. So I created this fun little word art. I know there's a real answer for that. And if any marketing people are listening, they're actually blurting it out right now. Can't hear you, sorry. But with that said, you'll see those letters. I mean, the words that are bigger are the ones that really stand out as what's most important to them. So like I said, when it comes to the evaluation process, we need medical, funding, functional desire, plus whatever that client feels is the most important things to them. And then voila, you'll find power wheelchairs to help you live happily ever after. And of course, we can't forget about our funding too, but in general, it's 3 main categories that we're looking at: clinical needs, maneuverability, and overall function. Moving along here to a nice little clip, which I like. So let's continue on. I'm going to take another sip of water. As that information was pulling up, you'll see a lovely wheel, a gear, a wheel, whatever you would like to call it. But this is power wheelchair basis at a high level. Now, please note, I'm coming at this from the therapist perspective, from the clinical perspective. And when I talk about power wheelchairs, the things that I'm looking at are going to be slightly different, although one of them, a fair amount of similarities, than say my colleague, who I mentioned before, Dan Critchfield, our director of technical education. He may come at this a little bit different. But for me, when I look at power wheelchairs at a high level, that functional use, these are the things that I think are important that we touch on. Is there one that's more important versus the other? I'm a big fan of seating, guys. We'll chat a little bit about seating, but that is one thing that's important to me. So maybe that's why I biasly put it at the top of that circle. But also, I do have drive wheel on here because that is a consideration. But we're going to hit mainly on the other ones that go around the clock there. We have been on aesthetics. So seating. So glad we started with seating since it's my favorite area to focus on and one of the most important. So with seating, really and truly, after you do that full-on seating and position evaluation with your therapist and with your CRT provider and the client, you got to look at kind of do a hierarchy, right? And I call it a bit of a feature match. And what sort of seating is needed for that client? Does the client need minimal support, more of a sit and drive sort of wheelchair? They're going to be in it for shorter times during the day to get here from point A to point B. So maybe a captain style seating is going to work. Or maybe the individual is fully dependent and has some postural asymmetries and is unable to reposition themselves when it comes to changing positions for tilt, recline, pressure relieving. So we have to look at all of these and what actually, when it comes to electronics and the interface, how's that actually going to work and how's that base going to work? This is one of the biggest questions that we actually discuss within Sunrise when we're working with our product managers and engineers. And we ask, what does it look like? What seating's available and going to work with that client? Everything from the traditional cushion and back systems or to head supports to also the positioning belts. So really looking at all these things and how is that going to integrate in with that power wheelchair base that you select. Can't forget about power seat functions. Now power seat functions, this is how I was always taught when we talk about seating systems per se, is that a seating system, a lot of times people will think about what actually touches the client. So when I think about that, I think about, headrest, back, arm supports, lower extremity supports. I have also read and heard some folks discuss when it comes to seating systems, they also include power seat functions within that. I'm pretty much neutral on that. So for this presentation, you'll hear me refer to power seat functions. So it's a little bit separate, but it is important because it's part of the whole seating system because you are changing the actual position of the client utilizing the power. So does the client need tilt? I'm not going to get into all the different medical reasons as to why tilt, recline, and these sorts of things may be important. I believe we actually have another webinar. If not, we will get one up there for you guys on power seat functions. It's in our on-demand platform right now that really discusses and goes into clinically why you would need these. But if you've already identified during the evaluation that someone's going to need these interfaces, you got to make sure you're choosing your base, which base can actually handle all of these. Because some bases can and some bases can't. Drive wheel. Told you, tiny little bit on drive wheel because drive wheel is important. In case you're curious as to which of these 3 configurations of drive wheels initially existed, the very first one was rear wheel drive. No, as no surprise there. The wheelchair nerd in me has researched this, individuals who actually created first power wheelchairs, they added a motor, added the brains onto a manual chair. And then as time went on, front wheel drive systems were developed, and then mid wheel drives were the most recent systems that have been created. With that said, when it comes to drive wheel, what I think about here is not only where the drive wheel is in relation to the individual's center of mass, center of gravity, because think about where a lot of the weight is going to be, but then also how that chair turns, and last but not least, but what the individual experiences. Different reasons why you would go with different ones. Some of the things a lot of times people will think about is the turning radius, getting in and out of their home. We mentioned that by talking about accessibility. Another things to think about would be what the individual actually feels when they first get into that power wheelchair. And what I mean by that is working where I worked for a number of years in the DC metro area, a lot of our families are in very small homes. And a lot of the clients that I worked with were little kiddos. By little kiddos, I'm talking like your 1.5, 2, 3, those guys, little tiny guys were the ones that really I focused on a great deal early in my career. Before a lot of the things came out, I was so excited to see now like Go Baby Go and all that stuff coming out. But one of the things that we realized is that if we focused on a mid-wheel drive chair for those kiddos, it mimicked a bit more. As you know how when kids first start to walk, you'll see them do circles, right, and kind of like spin around and kind of like experiencing how their body feels in space if they're learning to walk. Similar sort of principles were actually discovered as we worked on power wheelchair training. Now, is that saying that I'm of the mindset of that mid-wheel drive chair is the only ones that should exist? Absolutely not. The training on a dime and the overall sensation for that client may feel is important, but also we have to think about if someone needs, for example, to larger front wheels to get over larger obstacles. Or historically, you'll see that if someone has utilized a manual wheelchair for a number of years, they really like the power of a rear-wheel drive chair because where the power is coming from is a tiny bit behind that center of mass and where that weight is. So it gives them a bit more speed and whatnot when driving across difficult terrains and whatnot. They may want that. So don't want to spend too much on drive wheel, but just some things to ponder. Actually have a whole hour-long presentation on drive wheel too we could discuss, but we've got some really cool resources I'll share with you towards the end of this. Another thing to think about with drive wheel, not just the position of the drive wheel, right? What about the size of that drive wheel? This is something you could do. I just pulled 3 examples off of our site, looking at specifically the dimensions of the drive wheel. As I mentioned, we'll be doing another webinar where we'll take a deep dive into the product-specific options here. But I want you guys just to bear in mind that, pondering what size of that rear wheels, not only the primary drive wheels, but also what happens there with the caster wheels. What is the size of those? What is the first thing, you think about with a caster wheel is that's the first thing in a mid-wheel drive chair and also a rear-wheel drive chair that touches obstacles. So you have to think about the science of that, right? If we're trying to get over an obstacle, kind of a rule of thumb that we would say is that half of the height of the actual caster wheel. So if it's a 6-inch caster wheel, not going to be able to go higher than a 3-inch obstacle in theory. So really thinking about that too when it comes to what actually had that drive wheel configuration and also the sizes of that. And then of course getting over larger objects too. What happens, we're going to do our best to decrease the chance of high centering. So drive wheel, the size can play an impact, but then also with everything there are pros and cons, right? So if you're looking at someone who is really has a tighter space to live in, maybe smaller in stature, they may really lean towards something like a smaller base chair here. So you'll see that's the first column we've got there. And you'll look at the things to consider for the overall footprint of the chair. So you're looking at the width, the length, and also the turning radius. So this primarily you're thinking of trying to get into doorways for folks that travel a great deal if they're doing a lot of indoor travel, meaning when they're traveling, they're not going to outdoor locations, but they're spending more time in areas where maybe they might not be quite as accessible, whether it be in I think some of my friends that travel abroad, their concerns are some of the older buildings that are a bit more narrow. Maybe moving towards a more narrow base would be an option. But if you've got someone who says, hey, I travel a ton, suspension is key to me, I'm outdoors a lot, maybe you would need to go to a bigger footprint and they want to have that give and take because you're not going to be able to have everything perfect for every individual. The kind of the premise behind educating on this and understanding a greater portion of deciding on options related to a power wheelchair base is so you can be able to articulate that to your clients to help them make those decisions. So in some instances, and for example, a great example I have of this, and I apologize if you can hear my dog drinking his water, but hey, that's what happens to record live webinars at home. With that said, I had a dear friend of mine who ordered a larger base chair, or not a larger base chair, I shouldn't say that, but ordered let's just give the real life example, right? The Q700, she got a brand new Q700 and it was delivered. And then a few months later, Sunrise had launched the Q300 and she kind of tongue-in-cheek sent me a text and was like, hey, why didn't you tell me that you guys are coming out with a smaller base, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, of course, working within Sunrise, I was aware that we had a newer base coming along. And the reason why I didn't is because one, she was in desperate need of a new chair at the time. And then two, I also knew her lifestyle. And when I described to her the differences and kind of what the give and takes would be in terms of what options were available on the 300 base versus the 700, she's like, the 300 sounds really cool and be really great for some situations, but I think the 700 is still where I want to go. And mind you, she'd been into the previous generations of the 700 chairs, and she really liked the suspension that it offered. And so size to her and her whole world had already been set up for it. So size isn't always everything. Excuse me. Another thing related to dimensions specifically, seat to floor height. This is something I feel like a lot of times we focus on when talking about manual wheelchairs. And for me, from my personal experience, seat to floor height would often come up when it was a situation of, oh my goodness, we delivered a power wheelchair and now this person cannot fit up underneath their steering wheel or their drive system they've got in their vehicle, or if they have a specific setup at work, they can no longer fit under their desk. So being able to have all of these different types of electronics that they need to be able to do power seating, to be able to do power standing or power elevate, we've got to also make sure that we can still get it at a seat to floor height that will allow that individual to get under desks, for example, or at tables, wherever they previously have been gauging. So looking at how low of a seat to floor height can I get when I add on all these other options is something that you want to talk with. If you're a complex rehab technology supplier or a clinician, you can talk with your representative from your manufacturers to ask those specific questions. Electronics, moving along, because electronics, we're talking about the brains of the chair, fall somewhat within the base options, kind of where they live. So I just want to touch on this briefly because there are some that live in other parts. I admit that. For my super technical people out there that are giving Corey those comments going, doesn't she know that joysticks also have wires? And doesn't she know that some of them go into the back of the chair? I do. I just wanted to include electronics in this too because I think a lot of times we will focus on different options that are available with electronics too and kind of wrapped up within the base discussions too. So real quick, when I think electronics, one of the things I oftentimes remind folks of is user-friendly. This is a reminder for me when I first started, early 2000s, right? Super excited to do power wheelchair evaluations, really helping our folks get there. I mean, I'm the young new grad that's got like a lot of different ideas and super, super excited. And then we would have difficulty, even if it was a demo, because we had an inpatient, outpatient portion of our facility. We'd set it all up and then to come in after a weekend and nursing was like, we couldn't get that individual up in their chair because how this thing worked. So just because you can get them super complex that you can control everything with the touch of your finger doesn't necessarily mean that it is where you need to go. Keep it as user-friendly as possible. Choose setups that will work for that client. Like if you're trying to decide, okay, well, what's an example here? Okay, on some of your power wheelchairs, they'll come up with, say, 5 profiles, right? Do you need to have all 5 of those profiles active? I don't know. So keep it simple when it comes to choosing electronics and also setting up. It's important. Another thing about keeping it simple is a lot of times people really get excited when they think about like the expandable electronics, right? Because you can do various things with expandable electronics. I could do Bluetooth. I could do multiple actuators. I can set it up so the person can access their TV if they're doing it through infrared. There still are some uses for infrared that are needed out there. But what happens if you've got someone who doesn't need all of that? Is necessarily going to, or in a situation like my parents' generation right now, who are in their early 80s, my parents just went over to smartphones. Just pause and let's think about that. Whew. Yeah, so my parents just went over from flip phones to smartphones just recently, and that was a big, a huge, and it still is. Every once in a while I'll get a video call from my mom and she'll tell me that she has no idea how her phone managed to call me through a video call. It's crazy, Mom. That phone does what it wants on its own. But with that said, if my mother was ever to get to a point where she needed a power wheelchair, I probably, and all she needed was tilt on there, I probably would lean towards and be perfectly happy with, say, the non-expandable electronics, one for fun being our favorite F word, right? But then also thinking about I can get a single tilt actuator available on a non-expandable chair with a little bit easier way for her to access that. And then also the other thing we're user-friendly is sometimes the joysticks with all the bells and whistles may not be ones that just because you can get the color LCD screen with a bright and vibrant, that could be too much for somebody. So really think about that as far as when you're choosing your different features of your electronics too. But then of course, programmability and flexibility. What if the client has changing needs over time and you need to take things or add things to it? You think of maybe someone who has a progressive condition such as ALS. What was that chair going to look like from when you potentially evaluated the client for it, when hopefully you get that chair in pretty quickly versus maybe 6 months from now or even less time than that, because depending on how aggressive and how fast the person functional abilities change. So also looking on here, what can be programmed? This is another thing to think about when I'm talking about your electronics is, finding out, okay, what can I do to what can I do to really set up that chair to be a success for that client? Because sometimes I've had folks who've said, this power wheelchair base is a piece of junk, or this chair, this whole thing is a piece of junk because it doesn't drive appropriately. when really truly I could go in and make some tweaks and some changes. This is a true story. I can tell you many true stories related to this. Make some tweaks in regards to how the chair performs within programming, and that person is able to be successful with that. So I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty with this right now, but various things that I think about is how many options do I have, or through the assistance of our complex rehab technology provider or the technicians there, can they help me if I need to tweak and become more specific with things if the person has a progressive condition? Maybe I've also got a situation where right now they don't need to move into an alternative input device, but maybe down the line they do need an alternative drive or input device. So looking at that, but then also what happens with operation of the actual seating system itself. So one of the things I think about here is, do you need to incorporate switches? What about programmable buttons? Here's a quick way that I oftentimes remember programmable buttons is I've got some friends that drive from their power wheelchairs, and when going into their van, their vehicle, they hit a button and it automatically configures it so their chair actually will drop down to the lowest level, because as they're going in on the ramp, they get too high, they don't want to hit their heads. So you can actually set that up so you don't have to think about it each and every time. And some of your chairs with the electronics have that available and some don't. So looking at, what is medically necessary, what is justified, where if you actually get those programmable buttons on that individual's chair, making sure that they're actually programmed, customized for that individual. Other things to think about, you can do this in different ways as far as electronics to help with actual driving of the chair. There are some motors that specifically come with the ability to, and this is something that Dan Critchfield, I know you're listening, so I'm not going to get into too deep. I may have you explain that at some other point, but as far as the nitty-gritty of the electronics go, but you could do something that is called SureTrack, and you can actually be able to set it up so that the tracking on the chair allows that client to, what's the easiest synonym for this I often think about is like if your tires are not aligned appropriately, they may pull to one way or the other. Well, actually that can happen with the motors too. So really setting it up so they are having the same amount of pull and evening out, so potentially go a bit straighter. Where I oftentimes will see this utilized the most and needed the most would be if someone is driving with switches or something that's non-proportional, because non-proportional devices, if you hit the switch to go one direction, is programmed to go that direction. So if there are any other sort of outside interferences, like a little pebble in the road, or if the grading of the street kind of pulls to one way or the other, that chair is actually going to pull that direction too. There's technology, actually electronics, that can be built in to help overcome that. Definitely not needed for everybody, so don't get excited and think it's needed for everybody. It's technology. It's been out there for a number of years, but just a nice little gentle reminder that this can help make or break that. And if someone is, like, once again, using a proportional device, they're not going outside, or on a consistent basis, whatever happens within their home is pretty consistent, that sort of thing may not be appropriate or needed for them. Can't forget with electronics is also what are the other options if you've got external things that need to be set up for it. Once again, this goes back to the brains of the chair. This is how I'm relating it to talking about the base of the chair. When I think about this, everything from hardwired devices, I had a dear colleague of mine within the industry who reminds me of this a lot, is that you can still hardwire in different things. I know it may not necessarily appear on everyone's order forms, but this can still be accomplished. And I'm hoping this option never goes away, because especially for my clients that utilize communication devices. And with that said, with a communication device, Bluetooth drops quite frequently. Bluetooth on currently my keyboard, my Bluetooth keyboard is not consistently working this morning. It's like they notice me constantly touching higher on my computer to get my laptop keyboard working. Understanding what can be controlled by each. Is infrared still available? It is. There are some things where some folks who continue to use smart home prefer infrared. As I said, pluses and minuses to everything. You got a little bit sidetracked on talking about communication devices. The benefit to having them hardwired in is because we want to make sure someone always has access to their voice. Speaking of voice, let me take another sip of water. As we move into suspension. Now, when looking at suspension, I highly recommend with suspension taking a deep dive with your end user As far as their medical history goes here, I've had some lots of folks who've had rods put in their backs that will talk about the reduction in vibration that is offered through newer suspension options out there, allow them to be able to drive their power wheelchair longer periods of time during the day without any pain. Best examples that I always give of this is a dear friend of mine. When I was talking to her about suspension back in the early 2012, when we first became friends, I was talking with her about different things I was working on. I was new to Sunrise, working on presentations, and I was like, talking about the most important things on your power wheelchair. She brought up suspension as being one of her primary ones, and she said, you know, the interesting thing was, prior to me getting the chair that I'm in now, which was new in 2012, she said, I didn't notice suspension as quite a big deal. She actually contracted transverse myelitis at the age of nine months, and has now lived well into her 30s, professional, out there doing great things. Presents more like C4, C5 spinal cord injury is kind of where the transverse myelitis attacked her spine. So with suspension, looking at what happens with the client in terms of being able to last longer periods of time. Long story short, this friend of mine was telling me that suspension and how it's evolved over time has played a great deal because she's extremely active in her community, extremely active user. And so having suspension makes it so she could drive and be alert and be awake for longer periods of time and stay in her chair longer. The other thing that people think about with suspension is what sort of terrain are they going over? What are they experiencing every single day? Because they want to be able to not only get over gravel and whatnot in their daily commute from their vehicles inside their school or what have you, but if they are someone who does like to go out on the weekends, or they live in an area where there's inclement weather or lots of snow and whatnot. We're going to continue to hopefully go on. We're almost done with the presentation, and yeah, hopefully it doesn't glitch out on us again. Batteries here. Batteries, this is something that actually my colleague, Dan Critchfield, I've mentioned him a lot. Dan, lots of shout outs to you on this webinar, but Dan actually did a webinar on this earlier in the calendar year. Highly recommend our technical folks and also our clinicians just to kind of listen to that. It's available for a free listen on our website, because going through and understanding what is the difference between the batteries, because some batteries might give you the advantage of having a lower seat to floor height because batteries live in that base, right? So you may be able to put that person at a lower level where they can get underneath their desks or tables, whatnot. But if they do that, are you making it compromising, say, how long the battery is able to run during the day, or what happens with their maximum daily range? Or can they go less mileage? And then how often, how does it need to be charged? What does that look like? And of course, you can't forget about, we talked before about can the battery be on an airplane or not? So looking at these different options is also something just to know a little bit about. Even my clinicians, I encourage you guys to know a bit about that. Motors, as we go through this, there are different types of motors that I can specifically think of that fall on the Sunrise portfolio. Once again, not overly technical with this, but things I think about when, if you do look at the specific motors that are available on individual chairs, you'll see some may be listed as 2-pole, some may be listed as 4-pole. And what has been explained to me with that, as far as helping 2 versus 4, is really kind of expanding the load of the work, if you will. One of my colleagues up in New York actually explained this really well when he was talking about how if you have 4 people helping with something versus 2 people, the fatigue and the wear and tear on the 4 people over time potentially would be less than on 2. And so we think about that with the 2-pole versus 4-pole motors and what exactly is needed for the internal components there. Now, for some folks, if they're not using their chair a ton, they may be more of a sit and drive user. Maybe 2-pole motors are okay with them. But if you've got someone who's extremely active user, out and about in the community a lot, 4-pole motors might be the way to go. So really going over those pros and cons with folks. Speeds, oh my gosh, speeds is something that people ask us about all the time. And I get that, because if you're living around where I live, which is the Washington, D.C. metro area, it is not uncommon to go downtown, right near our nation's capital, and there to be 8-lane streets. And the folks talk about, hey, I need to be able to get across the sidewalk, get across the street and know that I'll be able to make it as that little countdown is going down for the pedestrians. So how fast can I do that? But also thinking about if someone might need high-speed motors where if they're on a college campus or whatever, what have you, but then also how can those speeds be maxed out? Sometimes we'll tell folks that your chair can go up to XYZ miles per hour, and then a loved one might say, well, we don't ensure that's the miles per hour that our child needs to be going in school or at home. You can actually do some programming on that if you've got a chair that allows you to do some tweaking of that programming. Most chairs do allow you to do that, to really set it at a more appropriate version for them. Another options would be heavy duty motors. These motors may be a part of packages if someone kind of reaches the threshold for the weight capacity for a standard chair. They might need to jump up to the heavy duty motors. And as you imagine, pulling a greater weight, the motors need to be just a tad bit different. So these motors will be able to accommodate that individual's specific needs too. Weight of the chair. This is something that I didn't necessarily always think about. Part of the reasons why I probably selfishly didn't think about that as where I live, as I mentioned before, I'm in the DC metro area. We have a pretty, now if any of my folks in the area are listening or may have experienced our transportation around here, you might be saying, don't know if I agree with that, but I would say we have decent transportability when it comes to public transit. We can have folks that utilize Metro or Metro Access, which is a bus that will come and pick you up from your home and take you to a metro station to be able to use that. So a lot of folks will use public transit if they have power wheelchairs, and it's not quite as large of a concern as folks in more rural areas. Another area I think about is that I do have a lot of folks, a lot of parents of children with disabilities that I work with, and that's one of the biggest concerns that they have is, how am I going to be able to transport my child's chair? And so specifically thinking of a client I know of down in Florida that I've worked with, is the reason why they picked a specific chair for her in the base was because it was under that threshold that allowed them to actually transport the chair on one of these tow hitch it's a tow hitch transportation device. I cannot think of the name of it, but you're allowed to, able to hook it onto depending on the model of the chair, obviously work with the companies, Google that, work with the companies for transporting it and how much that would work, but on which vehicle. But those guys will have specific weights that they can and cannot accommodate, which makes perfect sense. So looking at that, but then also another thing, if you're trying to get under a certain weight capacity, not capacity, but overall weight of the chair, different things that impact that would be additional components that are on the chair, and then also related to even the batteries. So really looking at what is the overall weight of the chair. Sometimes people will ask you the overall weight of the chair because if they need to push the chair or a caregiver needs to push the chair, all the manufacturers have listed a weight of their base and the seating systems. Also, you can contact your manufacturer's representative to find that out. Although I will tell you that still pushing a power wheelchair manually it still weighs a fair amount. It's not going to be light as a feathers, but you can find out that information. Transit, as we kind of get close to wrapping up this webinar, transit is something. Is it needed? Will the client drive from the power wheelchair? Will there be a rider in there? If yes, what type of harness or tie downs they need? I have friends that utilize power wheelchairs, some that drive, and then some that have caregivers that drive for them. Folks talk about the Easy Lock is a brand of external lock that can be locking mechanism that can be put in a vehicle. Another brand is Q-Strengths that can be put in vehicles too. Talking with your manufacturer's representatives to say, hey, I'm going to buy this base. Then I need to be able to take it to a local transportation company to get another piece added on. Is your chair compatible with that? Most of those companies will be able to tell you that, yes, we have tested our locking mechanism with the base of that wheelchair. So having an understanding of what the compatibility is there, but then also, what if you've got a situation where the person travels a lot or they don't have the ability to utilize an Easy Lock system because those aren't necessarily there are additional cost on that client, so maybe they have a van that they can get a portable ramp for, but they can't afford to do something like an Easy Lock system in there. They do have, asking about what do the tie downs look like? Was it transit tested? Was it occupant tested? These are the sorts of questions that, believe it or not, are things that we need to ask. Now, for someone, you might say, oh, well, of course they're going to be occupant tested. Well, not necessarily. If you've got a situation where a chair is going to be transported on the back of that vehicle, like I was showing you, in those situations, the person's actually not riding in the chair inside the vehicle. So maybe that type of system might not need to be transit tested with the occupant in it. But if that person ever uses that same wheelchair and has those same tie downs inside a vehicle, then you're going to want an occupant tested. So really having a better understanding and talking with folks to understand what exactly goes into that transit is going to be key too. And asking those questions, what's included, what's not included, as far as what's insurance going to pay, will be key. Aesthetics is kind of our last big slide to talk about. It's funny, I talk about aesthetics, lights packages. I can remember when first putting on lights on a chair was more for aesthetics or a cosmetic look. I worked at a pediatric hospital, so we had lots of kids right when those LED lights were first coming out that really wanted to jazz up their chair. They wanted to put, now in 2022, you'll see this in a lot of teenagers' rooms. There are LED lights in different colors and all that kind of good stuff. But before that, folks are putting that on power wheelchairs. Now you're seeing lights, which this is actually something I'm happy about, because a lot of folks, when somebody rides a bike, somebody rides a scooter at night, or even just walking around at night, when I'm walking my dog, meaning folks who don't use mobility devices as their primary means of transportation or ability to get around, we have lights that are available for that, so other cars and other pedestrians can see them. The same thing actually holds true for power wheelchairs. I have an understanding of what types of lights are available on those chairs are key. There's some of the things that could be done is the lights, for example, that are on the power bases within Quickie have actually been, because we are a global company, have actually been transit tested for or up to the standards of Europe as far as what is needed to be able to drive on roads and whatnot. So that plays a huge role. I've had lots of people talk about that as major for safety. You can have some that have indicators that show you turning if the person's going to be heading left or right. We think about that, at dusk. Think about that during the day. I mean, how popular have daytime running lights been on cars? So lights, aesthetics, but also could be a safety thing. So really talking about that. And of course, the aesthetics of the shroud, we can't forget that. Decking it out. How can the client be able to customize or personalize that for them? Believe it or not, you might get to the very, very end of your decision-making process and still have either two different brands or two different chairs within the same portfolio, and the person might say, I like this version of purple better than this version. I recommend waiting to the end to discuss that, but looking at that can also be a decision-making process. So as I whip through all these guys that were on our lovely circle, looking at like matching the categories to the different power wheelchair base components. I'll do this as a quick little aha moment. But look at all these different things where clinical need impacts, where some things cross-section, where for electronics, this could fit into clinical need, maneuverability, and overall function. And you'll notice that overall function actually goes to all of them. Clinical need doesn't necessarily go there, but one could argue, and the overall importance, not when I'm talking about funding, but the overall importance for the chair, overall function is equal, if not higher, than what happens with the clinical need. We could debate that topic for quite some time, but we want our clients to be able to utilize a chair at the end of the day and be able to improve their overall quality of life. Objective reviews, talk about different questions you can answer. I gave you all sorts of different questions that you might be talking with a person about during the interview process. Where do they live? How long have they lived there? If they can make modifications to their home, where do they like to go on the weekends? Who do they spend the most time, family with? What are they doing? Talk about 3 different components of a wheelchair base. Talked about a bunch. Talked about everything from batteries to motors to lights to seating systems to all of that. So yay, we met that objective. And talk about different things when it comes to transportation, which we talked about. Is the person going to be able to physically drive the chair? Is the person going to be a passenger in the chair? What about transporting that chair on the back of the vehicle? What resources are available to you? Our education and motion side of our website actually has a lot of fantastic resources for everybody who is on the provider team. So if you are someone who is credentialed as an ATP and you work for a CRT provider, if you're a technician, or if you're a clinician, we've got some great resources on there. These resources will also be included in the email that goes out within 48 hours post this webinar with your certificate and all the CEU information. But wanted to put them on here too, just in case you wanted to check these out. There are some other great resources available. These are our references. And even though we had some technical difficulties there, Corey, which I don't know what the heck that happened there, we do have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. Did anything come in as I was going through that?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. The first one says, is it possible to determine how much a power wheelchair will weigh to see if it will work on a lift?
Oh yeah, so that's a that's a big question, no pun intended. I would say talk with your manufacturer's representatives and or customer service if you're on the provider side of that and ask them. I know, for example, in Fresno, California, where right now most of our power wheelchairs are manufactured, we can get weights for them. Just to have an idea of different components, and of course the actual base itself, we can break down how much that weighs. But definitely talking to your manufacturer's representative to get a specific answer, because as with the same thing happens with manual wheelchairs. If you add different parts and pieces and components on there, some um, will weigh more than others.
Okay, and the second question, I think it came in when you were talking about the importance of programming a power wheelchair, and they asked if you know of any classes or resources to teach people how to program power wheelchairs.
Great question. I'm a firm believer in therapists and knowing how to program power wheelchairs and having a good understanding of it, and also obviously for our folks on the technician side and our provider side. But hold on, my providers and technicians, don't get too scared. The reason why I think it's important is not so individuals will be programming individual client wheelchairs as far as making adjustments, but for everyone to have an overall understanding of it. And yes, this is something we have within Sunrise offered a couple of times over the years. And this is something that I know that my colleague Dan, now that we have a official technical education team working within Sunrise, we're excited about that. We've done technical education for years, but now we are working on building a team. And this is something that, having a technical or technician side and serviceability understanding of programming a chair, but then also clinical side. So hopefully Dan and I can team up in the near future and work on some clinically specific programming for a chair. But then also if you have any technical or service technicians have questions, I will definitely direct you to Dan for that too. We can get some classes created for you guys.
And another question just came in. They say, will there be any lithium options in the near future?
Ooh, that's product specific. I can't get into that right now during this one. We can definitely send an email to you at a later date, and I'll team up with our product manager to make sure we get you the most accurate information for that. But yeah, sorry, CEUs, I'd have to abide by that, but we'll get back to you. Don't worry.
All right, and last question I'm seeing, maybe hopefully a quick one. What does ISO stand for?
Oh, ISO comes up during the transit discussion, because some of what happens is the tie downs. You guys have probably seen that. So whoever had that question, not sure if I mentioned that during the webinar. I meant to, so thank you for bringing it up. ISO, what does that stand for? You'll see on some of the ISO transit approved. So that's an international standards organization. It's actually a non-governmental organization that is international in the name. They do different standards for various things, and I believe it's based in Switzerland. So it goes beyond just what is required in a specific country. It looks like kind of international needs. So good question.
All right, yeah, I think that's all the questions that I'm seeing. So thanks so much, Angie. It was great. I learned a lot, which is always good. So, and everyone watching, as Angie mentioned, we will be sending out an email within the next 48 hours with all of the handouts and resources. So hopefully that'll be helpful for you. And if you have any questions for Angie, feel free to reach out at her email address right there on the screen, angie.kiger@sunmed.com. And to watch past webinars that we've done, you can go to sunrisemedical.com/EIM. And I hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be in May. We'll have a technical webinar and a clinical webinar both in May. So definitely stay tuned to your email inbox for that. And as soon as this webinar finishes and we close it out, a survey will pop up, and we would really appreciate if you can complete that survey. It kind of just helps us to know what you guys want for future webinars and how you enjoyed this webinar. So please complete the survey as soon as we finish this webinar right here. So otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope that you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you in May. See you later. Thanks.